A summation. No question, the word anarchy freaks people. Yet anarchy, ruled by no one, has always struck me as the same as democracy carried to its logical and reasonable conclusions. Of course, those who rule, bosses and politicians, capital and the state, cannot imagine that people could rule themselves, for to admit that people can live without authority and rulers pulls out the whole underpinnings of their ideology. Once you admit that people can, and do, today in many spheres of their lives, run things easier, better, and more fairly than the corporation and the government can, there's no justification for the boss and the premier. I think most of us realize and understand that in our guts, but schools, culture, the police, all the authoritarian apparatuses tell us we need bosses, we need to be controlled for our own good. It's not for our own good, it's for the good of the boss, plain and simple. Anarchism is a demand for real freedom and real autonomy. But I also remain convinced that something like an anarchist future, a world of no bosses or politicians, one in which people, all people, can live full and meaningful lives is possible and desirable. We see glimpses of it all around us in our day-to-day lives, as people organize much of their lives without depending on someone to tell them what to do. We see it in that spirit of revolt, a spirit that is often twisted by anger and despair, but nonetheless shows us that people have not given up. We see it in the political activism, the social lives, the demands for decency and respect and autonomy people put forward, the desire to be individuals while still being part of a community. No, I don't think bowling leagues are the anarchist utopia, but they, like much of our lives outside of the workplace, are organized without hierarchy and oppression. The most meaningful, truly human part of our lives already work best when organized on anarchist principles. Yet, I also believe that in its function as critique and as a vision of the future, perhaps the only one that doesn't end in our extinction as a species, or, as Orwell put it, as a jackboot smashing a human face forever, anarchism is not only desirable, but possible and necessary. Mark Lyra, The Case for Anarchy. Section A. What is anarchism? Modern civilization faces three potentially catastrophic crises. Number 1, social breakdown, a shorthand term for rising rates of poverty, homelessness, crime, violence, alienation, drug and alcohol abuse, social isolation, political apathy, dehumanization, the deterioration of community structures of self-help and mutual aid, etc. Number 2, destruction of the planet's delicate ecosystems on which all complex forms of life depend, and number 3, the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, particularly nuclear weapons. Orthodox opinion, including that of establishment experts, mainstream media, and politicians, generally regards these crises as separable, each having its own causes and therefore capable of being dealt with on a piecemeal basis, in isolation from the other two. Obviously, however, this orthodox approach isn't working, since the problems in question are getting worse. Unless some better approach is taken soon, we are clearly headed for disaster, either from catastrophic war, ecological Armageddon, or a descent into urban savagery, or all of the above. Anarchism offers a unified and coherent way of making sense of these crises by tracing them to a common source. This source is the principle of hierarchical authority, which underlies the major institutions of all civilized societies, whether capitalist or communist. Anarchist analysis, therefore, starts from the fact that all of our major institutions are in the form of hierarchies, i.e., organizations that concentrate power at the top of a pyramidal structure, such as corporations, government bureaucracies, armies, political parties, religious organizations, universities, etc. It then goes on to show how the authoritarian relations inherent in such hierarchies negatively affect individuals, their society, and culture. In the first part of this FAQ, sections A to E, we will present the anarchist analysis of hierarchical authority and its negative effects in greater detail. It should not be thought, however, that anarchism is just a critique of modern civilization, just negative or destructive. because it is much more than that. For one thing, it is also a proposal for a free society. Emma Goldman expressed what might be called the anarchist question as follows, open quote, "The problem that confronts us today is how to be oneself and yet in oneness with others, to feel deeply with all human beings and still retain one's own characteristic qualities." End quote. In other words, how can we create a society in which the potential for each individual is realized, but not at the expense of others? In order to achieve this, anarchists envision a society in which, instead of being controlled from the top down through hierarchical structures or centralized power, the affairs of humanity will, to quote Benjamin Tucker, open quote, "be managed by individuals or voluntary associations," end quote. While later sections of the FAQ, sections I and J, will describe anarchism's positive proposals for organizing society in this way, from the bottom up, some of the constructive core of anarchism will be seen even in the earlier sections. The positive core of anarchism can even be seen in the anarchist critique of such flawed solutions to the social question as Marxism and right-wing libertarianism, sections F and H respectively. As Clifford Harper elegantly puts it, open quote, "Like all great ideas, anarchism is pretty simple when you get down to it. Human beings are at their best when they are living free of authority, deciding things among themselves rather than being ordered about." End quote. Due to their desire to maximize individual and therefore social freedom, anarchists wish to dismantle all institutions that repress people. Open quote, "Common to all anarchists is the desire to free society of all political and social coercive institutions which stand in the way of the development of a free humanity." End quote. As we'll see, all such institutions are hierarchies, and their repressive nature stems directly from their hierarchical form. Anarchism is a socio-economic and political theory, but not an ideology. The difference is very important. Basically, theory means you have ideas, and ideology means ideas have you. Anarchism is a body of ideas, but they are flexible, in a constant state of evolution and flux, and open to modification in light of new data. As society changes and develops, so does anarchism. An ideology, in contrast, is a set of fixed ideas which people believe dogmatically, usually ignoring reality or changing it so as to fit with the ideology, which is by definition correct. All such fixed ideas are the source of tyranny and contradiction, leading to attempts to make everyone fit onto a Procrustean bed. This will be true regardless of the ideology in question, Leninism, objectivism, libertarianism, or whatever. All will all have the same effect: the destruction of real individuals in the name of a doctrine that usually serves the interest of some ruling elite. Or, as Mikhail Bakunin puts it, open quote, "Until now, all human history has been only a perpetual and bloody immolation of millions of poor human beings in honor of some pitiless abstraction: God, country, power of state, national honor, historical rights, judicial rights, political liberty, public welfare." End quote. Dogmas are static and death-like in their rigidity, often the work of some dead prophet, religious or secular, whose followers erect his or her ideas into an idol, immutable as stone. Anarchists want the living to bury the dead so that the living can get on with their lives. The living should rule the dead, not vice versa. Ideologies are the nemesis of critical thinking and, consequently, of freedom, providing a book of rules and answers which relieve us of the burden of thinking for ourselves. In producing this FAQ on anarchism, it is not our intention to give you the correct answers or a new rulebook. We will explain a bit about what anarchism has been in the past, but we will focus more on its modern forms and why we are anarchists today. The FAQ is an attempt to provoke thought and analysis on your part. If you are looking for a new ideology, then sorry, anarchism is not for you. While anarchists try to be realistic and practical, we are not reasonable people. Reasonable people uncritically accept what the experts and authorities tell them is true, and so they will always remain slaves. Anarchists know that, as Bakunin wrote, open quote, "A person is strong only when he stands upon his own truth, when he speaks and acts from his deepest convictions. Then, whatever the situation he may be in, he always knows what he must say and do. He may fall, but he cannot bring shame upon himself or his causes." End quote. What Bakunin describes is the power of independent thought, which is the power of freedom. We encourage you not to be reasonable, not to accept what others tell you, but to think and act for yourself. One last point, to state the obvious, this is not the final word on anarchism. Many anarchists will disagree with much that is written here, but this is to be expected when people think for themselves. All we wish to do is indicate the basic ideas of anarchism and give our analysis of certain topics based on how we understand and apply these ideas. We are sure, however, that all anarchists will agree with the core ideas we present, even if they may disagree with our application of them here and there.